Our second lesson this morning comes from Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 21. Listen now for a word from God. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind. And it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? How is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages we hear them, speaking about God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them, "Men of Judea and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say. Indeed, these are not drunk, as you suppose, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show portents in the heaven above, and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." Friends, the grass withers and the flowers fade, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Thanks be to God. Last week, when we talked about the ascension of Jesus, I asked you to think of the image that you get in your head when you think of Jesus rising into the clouds. And we were all able to come up with a vision because we've seen so many cartoons of that. This Pentecost story is another one that if you don't have a cartoon image in your head, it's very likely that you have seen artwork from throughout the ages and you have a vision in your head. Generally, it's people, a few sitting, a few standing, with a candle flame right above their head. And they all look pretty calm, pretty relaxed. Not a big deal, right? Or you may have seen other images that same people in a room, some sitting, some standing, all pretty calm, with the window open and the wind blowing in. Looks, dashed lines and kind of like waves blowing in. But nobody's too upset by any of this. Nobody seems overly concerned. And I wonder, isn't that really how we react to wind? A great wind, it says. And fire? Probably not. If you think about the gentle breeze that blows outside when it's a hot day, sure. But what about tornadoes and hurricanes? Or a sheer wind that moves across? I was outside one day at a zoo, beautiful blue sky, and the sirens started going off. And we all looked around, looked at each other, and kind of rolled our eyes. until everybody at the zoo came out and started herding people into buildings. And this sheer wind I'd never heard of before came and ripped doors off of buildings and toppled entire trees just like that. It was blue sky one minute and black the next. Wind is powerful. It's more than people sitting and standing and just kind of hanging out when this giant wind rushes through. And fire is the same thing. We look at these candle flames and we don't think much of them. They're controlled, they're small, it's okay. But think about wildfires. Think about forest fires. And think specifically about 1988 in Yellowstone National Park. Because I would imagine almost all of you remember the stories of the West is going up in flames. There were lightning strikes but no rain that summer, and a third of Yellowstone National Park, and it's huge, a third of it burned. Thousands of people were called to fight the fire. National Guard was called in to try and control these flames. Unsuccessfully until September 11th of that year when it snowed and finally got the fires under control. But we like control. As part of the human nature even, I think, we like control, and we can't control giant winds, and we can't control wildfires, but you know what we can control is how we remember those events. And so when artists draw pictures of this Pentecost story, they use a little candle flame and a gentle breeze coming in through a window. I seriously doubt that was how it was. I think it was more this wild, unpredictable power of God. People suddenly started speaking or hearing in languages different from what these people were capable of speaking. Frank Crouch writes, this Pentecost story was fear-inducing, adrenaline-pumping, wind-tossed, fire-singed, smoke-filled turmoil. And the people were bewildered, amazed, astonished, perplexed, confused, in an uproar, beside themselves, undone, blown away, thoroughly disoriented, and completely uncomprehending. This is the story of the unconstrained Spirit of God, the wild child. We like control. And the coming of the Holy Spirit is not about control. Well, maybe it's about God's control, but it's certainly not about ours. This story tells of the unbridled creative power of God on the move. This wind is the same that we hear about moving over the waters at creation. It's the wind that parted the sea for Moses and the Israelites to go across. This is the fire that burned the bush but didn't consume it when Moses was told to take off your shoes. This is holy ground. We try to tame the Spirit, just like we try to tame everything else. If we can control something, we feel like this is okay. And the Spirit isn't about being controlled, and it's not about being okay. It's about stepping out of what you're used to, stepping out of your comfort zone. It's about being pushed or blown into something new. It's like with the coming of the Spirit, these disciples are being called up to the big leagues. Can you imagine getting that phone call when you've been playing ball in the minor leagues and suddenly, I need you in Kansas City tonight. Go. The disciples are given what they need to go out into the world and to share this message of the gospel. And so they learned new languages. Now, I don't think they actually studied them, but somehow these languages were all being spoken. And I took this idea of learning a language another step and wonder, what is the language of our community? We know the language of our church community, but what about of Liberty? What about of Missouri? What about of our nation? What are the languages that we need to learn that we're not speaking? Yesterday, the Fellowship of the Concerned hosted Troubling the Waters, a conversation on race. It's a different language that many of us don't speak. Many of us don't even want to speak it. That's fine. But others of us need to learn these new languages, the language of poverty, the language of racism, the language of peace. And whether that looks like going to Jeff City to get arrested, to standing up for what you believe, or it looks like having a conversation with somebody you don't know, to learn where they're coming from. There are languages that we can learn. I don't think we're very good at learning other people's languages. I think we're pretty comfortable talking to one another. It's scary and it's hard work to step outside of what we know and learn somebody else's language. That's the message of this Pentecost passage. The message to live a little bit on the wild side, to let the Spirit pull you in new directions. There's a song called Light the Fire in My Heart. And the chorus says, light the fire in my soul, fan the flame, make me whole. Lord, you know just where I've been, so light the fire in my heart again. That's my prayer for myself and for all of us. Knowing that fire is wild and uncontrolled. That's the fire that we need to let God light in us again. May it be so. Amen.